Well, hi folks, and welcome to week number 16 on our Chronological Bible-in-a-Year reading challenge. This week we're continuing on with the story of David and his struggles with King Saul through the book of Samuel, as well as reading 25 of David's Psalm. This pattern of the narrative and then reading the Psalms is something we're going to be doing quite a lot of for the next few weeks, but until then, sit back, relax, and enjoy today's tutorial. Last week, you should have read basically the first 24 chapters of the book of Samuel, as well as 7 of David's Psalms. And what we witnessed last week was 2 major transitions, or at least one major transition, the transition of God's people being led by judges to now being led by a monarchy, now being led by King Saul, and that transition has been and gone, it's complete. Samuel, the last of Israel's not prophets, but the last of Israel's judges, all right, has well and truly handed the leadership over to King Saul. But there's a second transitioning that we are witnessing, and we're going to continue to witness this week, and it's the long and painful transition of King Saul, the first king, to King David. And this all began in chapter 15. Soon after King Saul was anointed, he disobeyed God. Samuel came to him and said, God is going to tear the kingdom from you and give it to another. And obviously we find out that man is David, and from there on in, Saul is out to destroy David until right the last story, the last chapter we read last week in chapter 24, where Saul is in a cave out to kill David. And David is hiding in that very cave and spares his life. And I don't know whether you noticed this, but one of the interesting things to me is that when Samuel told Saul, God is going to tear the kingdom away from you, he did it by a prophetic picture of the tearing of a corner of his robe. Okay, that's how the prophet demonstrated to King Saul that God is going to tear the kingdom from you, which is fascinating. Because in chapter 24 that you just finished this week, David comes to King Saul's robe. He cuts a piece off and then he hands it to him. And he said, Saul, I could have taken your life, but I've spared your life this day because you are my Lord, you are my master, you are my father. Far be it from me to take your life. Okay, isn't that an interesting picture? So what this is indicating, and what we see now through the story of David and through his Psalms, is that David has made a pledge that he will be innocent of ever taking down King Saul. If God is going to hand over the kingdom from Saul to him, to King David, the young David, if God is going to do that, then it is going to be God's doing. I'm not going to do it. I'll let him do it. So David wants everyone to see he has clean hands, that when that transition takes place, it will not be his doing. And we see that happen again this week in an incredible act of providence that I'll get to in just a moment. This week, you're going to be reading up to chapter 5 of 2 Samuel. Remember I said that 1 and 2 Samuel were actually originally one book. So this week you're going to be reading 11 chapters of Samuel, which at the end of the day, as I said, I reckon should be called 1 and 2 David. But anyway, leave that with you. And then also 25 of David's Psalms, which again are all written in this period. And get used to this, okay? Because for the next 6 or 7 weeks, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be reading stories about David and then Psalms that he wrote in that period. Stories, narrative about David, and then Psalms that he wrote in that period. This is going to be what it's like for us now for the next 2 months, okay? Because a lot of the Bible is dedicated to this man David. He is an absolute key and central figure in the biblical story. All right, what I'm going to do this morning is I'm going to give you a basic overview of what you're going to be reading this week and then highlight 3 things that I want you to keep your eye out for to help you in the big picture view of things. All right, so first of all, what you're going to read this week. This week's readings begin with the prophet Samuel dying. Okay, so Samuel's dead and everyone comes to mourn for him. King Saul continues to fight against David, not fight against him, but try to hunt him down, even though David spares his life twice. And what David ends up doing is he takes refuge with a group of the Philistines, okay, who are actually the enemies of Israel. So he actually ends up fighting with them and becomes a bit of a mercenary for them. One day, they go to fight against Israel, and David says, well, I'll come and join you, all right? I'll come and join like I've done for the last year or so. And they say no. They turn David away. They say, we don't want you to fight with us on this battle because we don't trust you, because we're fighting Israel. What if you turn against us and end up becoming our enemies and basically ambush us in between? So what they do is they send David back to his home. which is an incredible act of God's providence. Because it is in this battle the Philistines kill King Saul and his 3 sons. And David had nothing to do with it. In fact, David had his own battle going on with the Amalekites, which you'll read about. David had a perfect alibi. He was perfectly innocent. And again, this is God protecting David to demonstrate for everyone who cares to know that the death of Saul, the bringing down of Saul's kingdom, had nothing to do with David trying to usurp his throne. In fact, when David finds out that Saul and Jonathan die, he writes a song of lament. It breaks his heart, and he weeps for the loss of his father, okay, the guy who was out to kill him. Anyway, amazing example. What happens now, of course, is that David is going to be the next king. He takes control, or at least is anointed king over his own tribe first. But people who are supportive of Saul, the dead King Saul, still want to hold on to political power. And so here begins a war, as it were, between the house of Saul and the house of David. And so, as I said, this transition between these kings is not particularly clean. A lot of blood is spilt, and it's a lot slower than the transition over from the Judge Samuel over to King Saul. Okay, so it's a slow transition, it's a bloody transition, but there are lessons that we can learn from that as people end up playing politics and vying for power and not cooperating with what God said He'd do through the prophet, etc., etc. Anyway, so you're going to be reading about that this week. Here's 3 things that I want you to take special note of as you read this week. 3 things that have stood out to me. The first is this really strange story in chapter 28 of Samuel, where King Saul, before he dies, obviously, he's about to go to his last battle against those Philistines, and he needs a prophet to tell him what's going to happen. Okay, Saul is now losing the plot, and he's lost his connection with God. So what he does is he goes to a witch. Okay, or the official term really for her is a necromancer. She has the ability, or at least has a reputation, for calling up the ghosts of the dead. And so he goes to her and he says, listen, I want you to consult a spirit for me. I want you to bring back from the dead the prophet Samuel. And sure enough, as the story goes, she brings up the ghost of Samuel, who speaks to King Saul. Samuel's dead, remember? She brings up the ghost of Samuel, who prophesies accurately over King Saul and says, mate, this is your last battle. You and your sons are going to die. And by the way, why did you disturb me? And the reason I bring up this story is, again, because in the big picture view of things, I want to look at some of the big issues of life. And one of the issues of life I want to look at personally as we read through the Bible together is the developing understanding of what the afterlife is like. What do the Hebrew people believe the afterlife to be like? Now, when we get to the New Testament, a lot more is going to become clear to us, but we're not there yet. Okay, this is an unfolding revelation. So far in the Torah, all we know from Moses is that the afterlife, at least for Jewish people, okay, is described as a place where people are gathered to their fathers. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, all described, and Moses, all described that way in their death. They were gathered to their fathers. Well, here, and then we got Jacob, who is the first to mention a place of death called Sheol. He gives it a name. Death is a place that has a name. It's called Sheol. Then we have Job. We read about Job, who describes the place of Sheol, as he understands it, as a place of silence, a place of darkness, a place of quiet, a place of rest. And now we have Samuel coming up from Sheol, his soul or his spirit or his breath or his life force or whatever it's called, okay, his ghost, comes up from Sheol and he says, why did you disturb me? In fact, this week in David's Psalms, I also want you to pay attention to what David's theology is on the place of death. Because one of the things he says in one of his Psalms this week, I think it's Psalm number 6, is he says, in Sheol, in death, nobody praises you, God. Nobody speaks to you. So it is a place of silence. It is a place where people aren't praising God. All right, what I'm trying to say is, their understanding is people don't go to heaven when they die in this time of history. They go to a place called Sheol. They're gathered to their fathers. It is a place of quiet. It is a place of death. It is a place that is illustrated as being under the earth, or like the depths of the sea, complete darkness and complete silence. And so Samuel, according to this story, okay, as it reads, comes or is awakened from this place of death and says, "Why did you disturb me?" So interesting. I want you to pay attention to that as we looked at this continuing theme of the afterlife as it is progressively revealed through the scripture. The second thing I want you to take notice of is David's attitude towards King Saul, the man who is persecuting him. I said right from the beginning, from Genesis, we've got this motif, okay, this ongoing theme of the older persecuting the younger, okay, Cain and Abel, Ishmael and Isaac, Esau and Jacob, the 12 brothers or the 11 brothers, and Joseph, who persecute Joseph. All right, this motif is all the way through the scripture, and it is especially seen in the life of King Saul out to destroy King David, and then the house of Saul trying to bring down the house of David and persecuting them. Even though Saul's house is coming down and David's house is rising up, there is a period of tension. But what I want you to see and pay attention to is the attitude of the new order towards the old. You see, we don't really see this, maybe in Joseph, but yeah, not so much. We don't really see this in the other stories. But there is a great lesson here to be learned for those who are part of the new order that God is bringing on the earth. The attitude that they are to have towards the old. And even though David describes Saul and his men as evildoers and arrogant and hateful and evil, even though he says those things and he acknowledges those things to be true, when he is being persecuted by Saul, he does not retaliate in the flesh, as we saw in the cave. He did not fight with the sword. What he does instead is he points his praise and his cries to God for help. He says, "God, you need to be my vindicator, because I am not going to touch the Lord's anointed. Even though he is evil, even though I know prophetically you are bringing his house down and rising my house up." I want you to pay attention to David's attitude, because again, this is the theme that continues all the way through to the 1st century, when the Christians, the early Christians, the new wave of what God was doing on the earth, were being persecuted by the Old Covenant Jews. And this is a lesson to teach them their attitude in the book of Acts towards their Jewish brothers. And it is also a lesson for any of us who consider ourselves part of something new that God is doing on the planet, and how we are to respond to those who've gone before, even when those who've gone before us may be acting arrogantly or very harshly toward us. What a great lesson. I want you to pay attention to that. And the third thing I want you to do as we head towards 15 minutes, is to really pay attention to David's Psalms this week. Okay, you're going to be reading 25 of them. About half of them is David crying out to help to God when he's being persecuted by Saul and his followers, and sometimes even by Philistine armies. So you're going to see that. It's going to make sense to you this week. He cries out to God to help, to vindicate him. And again, he pleads his case of innocence. All right, he says, "God, I haven't done anything. I haven't touched Saul. Okay, I'm innocent of the shedding of this man's blood, but please save me from those who persecute me." The other half of the Psalms are basically songs of praise. They're all feel-good ones. Okay, so you'll enjoy them. And as I said earlier, the next 6 or 7 weeks, this is what we're going to be doing. We're going to be reading narrative and then Psalms, narrative and then Psalms, with all the focus being on David. Because the fact of the matter is, as much as we've seen of David so far in the story, okay, we've seen him as a shepherd boy forgotten by his father, but then anointed by the prophet. We've seen him killing Goliath with a sling, married into the royal family, and then the rise of his popularity in the palace. We've seen his friendship with Jonathan, his jealousy and betrayal of his father-in-law Saul. We've seen near-death experiences, his battles with foreign armies and his battles against foreign armies. We've seen him mourning over the death of Saul, mourning over the death of his friend Jonathan. We've seen his ordination over the tribe of Judah, looking forward to the day where he will be king over all Israel. But as much as we've seen of David so far, it's only the beginning. There is a lot more to David to come. It's going to cover 1st and 2nd Samuel, plus the book of Kings, plus the book of Chronicles, and heaps of Psalms. All right, so the next 2 months are full of David. We're going to enjoy him. I'm going to stop this video before we get to 15 minutes. Bless you guys, enjoy your readings, and yeah, have a great time. I'll see you next week. Okay, bye.
That's it for today's lesson. I really hope you enjoy your readings this week. Remember, allow yourself time to read as much as you can in one sitting. Don't get lost in the detail. Just keep going and watch the Bible's big story unfold before you. Remember also to hit me up on our social media channels or website, and I'll see you next time.